I said, we have Michael Nazar Ali. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael, and I'm going to share my screen so we can watch the PowerPoint. Go ahead, Michael.
Right. Thank you very much, Tom. Well, as some will know, this is the third of the lectures. The first was about the beginnings of mission planning, thinking, doing in the Anglican tradition. And then last time we looked at the more recent past, at the evangelical and Catholic revivals in the Anglican Church and how they affected mission. So today it's much more about the contemporary scene and what implications that has for us for the future. So if we are to plan for the future, we must know about the past. But the present is also very important. We have seen how different impulses within Anglicanism led to the emergence and development of a missionary consciousness amongst Anglicans. Much of what we see around us in the Anglican communion is a result of this awareness and its practical consequences. We need to ask now about what is happening in the communion as far as mission and evangelism are concerned. Which are the churches that are growing? Why are they growing? What are their attitudes to culture surrounding them? And can the rest of the communion learn from them? By the time the 1988 Lambeth Conference, and there you see some of the worthies who were at the conference, the Lambeth Conference of Bishops called for a decade of evangelism, many had already been praying about and considering this possibility. Some were therefore swift to respond to the call. Not everyone, I'm sorry to say, but some were. And I remember Joseph Adetiloe, then the Bishop of Lagos, and later to be Archbishop and Primate of Nigeria, telling me during a pre-Lambeth visit to Nigeria that the Nigerian church was preparing to send missionary bishops to the north of the country. You can see a map of Nigeria there, and you see the north, which is a mainly Muslim area. So they were preparing to send missionary bishops there as one of their responses to the growing Islamization and radicalization of that part of Nigeria. This was done promptly after Lambeth and its call for a decade of evangelism. In the end, 15 dioceses, missionary dioceses, were created, and the Church of Nigeria came to be recognized as the fastest growing province of the Anglican Communion. One of the interesting features of this step is that the Anglican Church in Nigeria is a CMS, Church Mission Society origin church. As we have seen through much of the 19th century, the growing Catholic movement in Anglicanism had been advocating missionary bishops in the sense of pioneers who planted churches that were organized on the lines of the primitive church without the compromises with the state found by them at any rate in the Church of England. This kind of thinking was generally opposed by CMS on the grounds that primary evangelism, church planting, and self-support were needed before a church could have bishops. When in the end CMS became willing to consider missionary bishops, what it meant was an expatriate missionary serving as bishop of a native church on a provisional basis until a native was ready for the episcopate. I mean, those were the terms used in those days. It is thus revealing that a church like Nigeria would appoint missionary bishops very much as pioneer missionaries in the sense advocated earlier by Bishop Wilberforce and the Catholic Anglican societies. We referred to them last time, you may remember. As far as we can tell, the strategy of the Nigerian church has been effective in this regard. Around the bishop have gathered those who were a remnant in relatively unchurched parts, and this has led to fresh evangelism and church planting in some of the most challenging situations in the world, often dominated by a kind of Islamist extremism typified by Boko Haram, but not limited to it. Goes much further than that. At the other end of Africa, in Kenya, the church has been involved for some time now with the largely nomadic people of northern Kenya. Like the Maasai, the Boran, the Gabra, and the Rendile are mobile peoples. They build temporary houses, and after pasturing their flocks, herds, and camels in an area for a short time, they move on to fresh pastures and new sources of water. The late Archbishop David Gitari tells us of his work when he was Bishop of Mount Kenya East and then Bishop of Kirinyaga. The evangelists and even the pastors have to travel with the people when they're ready to move. There can be no permanent church buildings. We have to return to the tent of meeting of the Israelites in the wilderness, soon after the Exodus. Divine worship, teaching, and fellowship have to be structured around the pastoring duties of the tribe. In the same way, Vincent Donovan, people may remember his Christianity Rediscovered, an epistle from the Maasai, you will note, tells us how the evangelism of a Maasai settlement had to take place early in the morning, before people went to their shepherding tasks. Those who could not attend because of other duties in the community were briefed later by those who'd been to the pre-breakfast gatherings. According to Father Donovan, even the decision to follow Christ and to be baptized was made by the whole Maasai community. So when he came to them, when they decided to accept baptism, he said, well, I will baptize the people who have been to my meetings. And the chief said, no, you will baptize everybody or you will baptize nobody. And he said, but what about those who have not come to my meetings? They have not been properly taught, catechized. And he said, the chief said to Father Donovan, these are the people who had to be out for some urgent reasons, and when they came back in the evening, we told them everything that you had taught us. So they are quite well taught and are also ready for baptism. And so in the end, the whole community was baptized. This question, of course, as you know, arises very often in mission situations where there is quite strong group solidarity, and there may be a discussion about this afterwards. People may want to tell us of their own experience. David Gitari similarly is of the opinion that work among the nomads of northern Kenya should be communitarian rather than individualistic in approach. This method of evangelism and discipling is based on the notion of Ubuntu, or community solidarity, which characterizes many African societies. John Beattie, the African theologian, has pointed out that for many Africans, the individuals can only claim his or her identity within the context of the community. I am because we are, those sorts of strap lines you will have heard. There is, of course, a danger in this approach as well as an opportunity. The danger is that change can be prevented if some are not in favor of it. And it can also be asked whether Christianity inevitably produces a heightened consciousness of the person and his or her response to and responsibility before God. You may be familiar with Larry Seidentop's book, Inventing the Individual, in which he lays the blame for the consciousness of the human person in the modern world squarely at the door of St. Paul. And I think he has a case in this. In any case, Gitari goes on to discuss the contextual evangelism which the church has adopted in relation to nomadic peoples. He relates how the first priest among the Gabra was ordained and with a camel and 40 goats set about his evangelistic and pastoral tasks. Not the usual equipment that one provides for a clergyman in the Anglican communion, but there we are. This way of equipping pastors and evangelists to adopt the way of life of the nomadic tribes has continued and has led to a number of group conversions. The pastors and evangelists live among the people, traveling in search of water and grazing. It is while traveling or watering the animals that the evangelists share the good news of Jesus Christ with their people. In the evenings, when the community gathers, there can be a discussion about what has been said earlier in the caravan or at the watering hole. These modern missional examples of planning religious activities in conjunction with the normal rhythms of community life are very much in keeping with the principles of a Catholic and Reformed Anglicanism as it emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries. As part of his commitment to contextualization, Archbishop Cranmer required public prayer for only 2 daily morning and evening services in the Church of England, because these were the most convenient times for workers to be able to attend, just as he had noted St. Basil the Great had done in the patristic period. Many of the things that the reformers, the Anglican reformers did were of course justified from the Bible, first of all, but also from the ancient fathers. So from the very beginning of modern Anglicanism, liturgical structure arose from missional needs, not the reverse. The work begun by Archbishop Guittari and his team is being continued today by interdenominational bodies like the 11th Hour Network, led by Getachew Bezebi, himself an Anglican priest. A number of the nomadic groups have been exposed to Islamization, and the dangers of radicalization are ever present, as in northern Nigeria, so it seems also in northern Kenya. This makes mission work among them both more challenging and more urgent. A recent consultation, you have the picture there, between those working with such groups and Christian leaders from the Middle East. This consultation happened at the request of the East African church leaders, but it was very effective in identifying culturally appropriate forms of outreach, and also how we can be alert to the first signs of radicalization, as well as to the steps which need to be taken if it becomes influential in particular communities. In Pakistan, the Diocese of Karachi, under the leadership of Bishop Chandu Ray, great missionary bishop, translator of the Bible, and the person who got the Bible in Tibetan into Tibet just at the time of the Chinese occupation of that country. As the Bishop of Karachi, he encouraged missionary work both by expatriates from CMS Australia and New Zealand and local workers among the nomadic and semi-nomadic Hindu untouchables in the Sindh province in the southern part of Pakistan. Thousands have come to faith as a result of the work of different churches and agencies. And the need now is for them to be integrated into the life of churches usually drawn from a very different Punjabi cultural background. So integration on the one hand, but also to be able to express their faith as far as possible in terms of their own cultural background. Bishop Bashir Jeevan of the newly created Diocese of Hyderabad in that part of the country made evangelism and church planting a priority of his episcopate in ways very similar to Guittari's. In fact, both of them spoke together about their evangelization at the Lambeth conference I've just mentioned. So both were committed to a holistic approach to mission, where social service, social activism, even political activism went hand in hand with evangelization. As the mobility of populations increases because of migration and refugees, we will have to learn from such approaches to mission, which are both contextual and light in terms of buildings, organizational structures, and mission. Another area where there's been significant, sometimes explosive growth is Southeast Asia. In Singapore, for example, Christianity grew from being 4% of the population in 1900 to around 13 or 14% today. In Malaysia, it has grown from being 1.5% in 1900 to about 9 or 10% today, with most of the growth being in what used to be the animist interior of Eastern Malaysia and among the ethnically Chinese and Indian communities. Again, in Indonesia, it has increased from 1.4% to nearly 14%. The Anglican dioceses of Singapore and Sabah have been particularly active in evangelism and church planting. During a visit to the church in Sabah, when I was the General Secretary of CMS, I was especially impressed to find single female Chinese missionaries working deep in the jungles among the Orang Asli, or the indigenous inhabitants of the area. This is pioneer mission indeed, and there can be no doubt that God is blessing such sacrificial service. Canon Michael Green describes some of the methods used by the churches in this region to grow Christians and to plant churches. This is his book that he wrote on his return from a visit there, called Asian Tigers for Christ. Asian Tigers for Christ, the dynamic growth of the church in Southeast Asia. So one of the features that Michael identifies is the cell group as central to evangelism. Members are committed to bring guests to meetings, and the groups are oriented to welcome and to showing hospitality. At some point, when the cell has grown to a certain number, it divides, and the whole task is then repeated in the new cell. Cells can also become the basis for a church plant, and these new churches in turn generate cell groups, and so the story goes on. Unlike traditional home groups in the West, the cell is geared for growth through welcome, teaching, discipleship, and dividing as soon as possible, so that more and more cells are created and the church grows wherever and whenever new cells come into existence. People are brought to faith and go out to serve their communities with the love of Christ and to bring more people to Christ. Nor is this all. A church on fire for mission, like the church in Southeast Asia, cannot remain content with mission at home, however successful it may be. It must look also to the world and to cross-cultural mission and evangelism. Here, the apostolic work of the Diocese of Singapore deserves notice. Bishop Kwan Kim Seng, the bishop responsible for the mission of the diocese, gives a number of reasons why the churches in Singapore began to engage in mission outside Singapore. Church leaders were themselves converts and were very aware, therefore, of the need to fulfill the Great Commission. The charismatic movement inspired people to share the gospel with others. The churches were maturing and had people and financial resources to reach out to the nations in the region. The smallness of Singapore meant that mission energies were not all consumed at home, and churches joined business and other interests in setting up beyond the borders of the city-state. As far as the Anglican Church is concerned, the Diocese of Singapore began by taking seriously its responsibilities for the nations that were notionally part of its jurisdiction: Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. Singapore clergy were appointed deans of these countries, at first in addition to their own parishes in Singapore itself. They were told not to be content with ministering to expatriates in these countries, but to plant indigenous churches. There are now such churches in Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, and Vietnam. Another deanery that was created was in a country where there'd been no Anglican church at all, ever, and where Christianity had for long been illegal. Some people from Oxford may remember Ramesh Khatri at Wycliffe Hall, a Nepalese pastor who went back and was sentenced to 6 years in prison for baptizing 2 people, 3 years for each. So it had been illegal, and then gradually the restrictions were removed, and an indigenous church, a very vigorous indigenous church, has come into being, as some will know. And at the request of the local churches and their pastors, who were keen to affiliate with a worldwide fellowship of churches, the Diocese of Singapore, in partnership with Anglican Frontier Missions, agreed to receive these churches and to develop their work and witness to a point where they could become a diocese in their own right. So here is a book, The Shadows from Light Unapproachable, celebrating 25 years of Anglican Frontier Missions, which gives an account of how these unreached parts are being reached today by Christians from churches like the Diocese of Singapore. Another example of cross-cultural church planting through a diocesan initiative is the way in which the Diocese of Egypt, North Africa, and the Horn of Africa has provided for the pastoral care of and church planting amongst Sudanese refugees in Ethiopia. This has now developed into evangelistic and church planting work among other ethnic groups as well. As the former area bishop, this is the new bishop, by the way, of the area being installed, but as the former, his predecessor, area bishop Grant Lemarkin, has told us in his regular newsletters, this is a new departure for Anglicans, who in the past have limited themselves either to chaplaincies for expatriates in Ethiopia or working for theological renewal in the Orthodox Tewahedo Church of that country. The presence of Sudanese, Somali, and other ethnic communities has given the church the opportunity to work in this pioneering way without reneging on its commitment to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Although the Acts of the Apostles, perhaps for apologetic reasons, presents the missionary movement of the church as being from Jerusalem to Rome, in fact, the gospel and therefore the church spread in every direction from the earliest times. Even in Acts, in the Acts of the Apostles, the conversion and baptism of the Queen's high official from Ethiopia and the presence of church leaders from Africa in the church at Antioch, at the time, for instance, of Paul and his companions being commissioned for the first missionary journey, points to an expansion beyond the Greco-Roman world. Outside this world, Armenia and Ethiopia became the first Christian nations. Armenia, there's an Armenian church. Bishop William Young, who was the Bishop of Sialkot in Pakistan, has well documented the expansion of the church in the Persian Empire, the other great superpower of the time, where Christians were tolerated and persecuted in turn. The Church of the East, as this church likes to be called, has had a glorious mission history of evangelization and the planting of churches in Central Asia, India, and China, both before and after the rise of Islam in this region. Even during the modern missionary movement, when mission was seen as being from the West to the rest, the actual carrier, that's the Nestorian tablet, which celebrates the work of the Nestorian, so-called Nestorian church. It's not something they call themselves. The work of the Church of the East throughout Central Asia in China and in India, and in many cases, as in Mongolia, where these missionaries from the Church of the East were responsible for reducing the language to writing, which script that they have produced is still used. We'll come back to that in a moment. Even during the modern missionary movement, when mission was seen as being from the West to the rest, the actual carriers of the good news were often indigenous Christians who took the faith to their own people or to others in their vicinity. The Reverend Abdul Masih, the first Anglican priest in India, a Muslim convert, was engaged in a pioneer ministry in Agra after his baptism from 1811. He combined evangelism with traditional Unani, that is to say, Hellenistic medicine widely practiced in the Muslim world, and had established a church in Agra before expatriate CMS missionaries arrived in the area. Towards the end of the 19th century, the Mozambican martyr, Bernard Mizeki, helped in the opening up of the country now known as Zimbabwe to Christian and specifically Anglican mission. Apollo Kivebulea of Uganda took the faith to the Congo, and of course, Bishop Ajay Crowther led the mission on the Niger River, which opened up Nigeria to the gospel. In East Africa also, the gospel was often spread by the first converts who took it to the hinterland and expressed it in ways more suited to the cultures of the people among whom they found themselves. Today, we are in a situation where a clear and growing majority of Christians is to be found in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. How should this affect our thinking about global mission generally and evangelism and church planting in particular? At the same time, while churches in the West are still relatively wealthy, their human resources, especially but not only in terms of cross-cultural mission, are much more slender. The missionary challenge in the West is also becoming much more significant. What gifts of people, talent, and money has the Lord of the Church given to his church so that it may fulfill the great commission he has left for it? Just recently, I was invited to a gathering in Argentina about the persecuted church in the Middle East, China, and Africa. Yes, you've heard right. The gathering was in Argentina, but it was about the persecuted church in the Middle East, China, and Africa. It was heartwarming to meet Christians from Latin America working in some of the most restricted situations in the world. For example, in Syria. We also heard from Christians who were working within their own regions, and we met with those who have been tortured and imprisoned for their faith, the living martyrs of our day. Argentinians are able to send out tent makers for mission to countries that may be quite close to any Western initiatives. This is also true of South Koreans and Indians. The Chinese have re-entered the field with the Back to Jerusalem movement, which aims to evangelize and to plant churches amongst people between China and Jerusalem. China and Jerusalem, that gives them quite a lot of scope for mission work. The West is also rapidly becoming a large mission field. This is not only because of immigration and refugees, although that is a significant factor in many countries, but also because of the loss of faith among so many. Almost the faculty of believing. Christians and churches in the West have to learn again the arts of evangelism, apologetics, and church planting, but they should engage in this mission in partnership with those from other parts of the world. At a Chinese Christian fellowship celebration of the Chinese New Year in an English city, I was particularly impressed with the way in which the Christian faith was expressed quite naturally in Chinese idiom. But it was its freshness that made its impact on many secular folk who would not otherwise darken the door of a church. the vibrancy of music and creativity in the Afro-Caribbean-led churches, the hospitality of the Asian ones, and the directness of the Americans can all contribute to making Christian faith credible again in Europe. It is for reasons such as these that more than 30 years ago I wrote my book From Everywhere to Everywhere, A Worldview of Christian Mission, published at that time by Collins. Mission cannot any longer be confined to sending and receiving countries. Denominations, mission agencies, and parachurch groups have to put together resources of people, money, and training and apply them to the neediest situations without regard to where each resource has come from. This is harder than it might appear, as churches want to own missionaries and their work. They want their own people to go out and wish to support them when they do. This may be natural and even laudable, but it will need to be set aside for greater effectiveness in the task of fulfilling the Great Commission, whether on the doorstep or in lands far away. If from Jerusalem to Rome was the first phase of mission, and the Nestorian mission to Asia, celebrated, by the way, in a great book by Sir Wallace Budge, called The Monks of Kublai Khan, which tells us of the extent to which the Nestorians had actually penetrated China. And not only that, but had sent monks to the West. By the West, of course, they first meant the Middle East. But when they got to the Middle East, they realized that there was further west. And so some of them actually came to Europe. One of the Chinese missionaries, became the patriarch of the Church of the East, of the Nestorian Church, and is still remembered by them for his work in mission. So whether it is the initial expansion or the Nestorian mission or the last episode of mission from the West, all of these have sown the seeds of a truly global fellowship of churches and Christians that is possible now for us even to think about. We are on the threshold of mission from everywhere to everywhere. What aspects of it should we keep in mind as we enter this new age? Are the people in our pews ready to respond to God's calling in giving and going and remaining? How should we be equipping them to be evangelists and church planters? And so in the next few lectures, I will turn to these questions. Many years ago, I outlined a mission grid which would allow us to audit our mission thinking and activities. In God's providence, this grid is now being used by researchers to explore what mission means in particular contexts and how churches are planning and delivering their mission strategies of one kind or another. So I'm hoping for the next 2 or 3 lectures to use a modified version of this grid to set out how I think we should be engaging in authentic mission during the 21st century. And so, God willing, for the next lecture, I hope to take the first element in that grid, which is about incarnational presence. Thank you very much.
Good. Well, thank you, Michael. We will now open it up for questions. If you wish to have a comment or a question, click on the participant button at the bottom, and then there's a thing that says raise hand. And so I will see your hand and I can call on you and unmute your mic. One of the things that, Michael, that you might know a bit more about, but I'd be interested hearing from you, is Anglican mission in China was quite significant up until the revolution.
Yes.
In fact, the head of the Three South Patriotic Church, Bishop Ding Guangshun, was an ordained Anglican. One expected him to have a young person ordained to replace him as he passed. That didn't take place. What is the residual Anglicanism in China, and how has that impact in terms of mission, or has it largely begun to fray and disappear into more the house churches or official churches of China?
Yes, I mean, that's Bishop Ding certainly was very active, but the decision was made by the Three Self Church not to have any more bishops in that sense, in the Anglican, Orthodox, and Catholic sense of the term. And so the Anglican episcopate died out. The Anglican Church, as it was not called the Anglican Church, and it was called the Holy Catholic Church in China, just as it is called the Holy Catholic Church in Japan. The only remnant of it, it's not just, it's quite a significant remnant, is in Hong Kong and the New Territories.
Okay.
Where there is an Anglican province and several bishops and of course priests and other people. But it has really now disappeared in the rest of China.
Yes. Good. Any further, any questions or comments? I don't see any hands raised. So, oh, there we go. Alfred, I'm unmuting you.
Anglicanism from Latin America, very early in the morning. Bishop Michael, thank you so much. Just to further, my question is on your everywhere to everywhere concept, and probably will come up in your grid. But of course, you may know that in between 1844 onwards, Alan Gardiner, the great Anglican pioneer, came to the south of Latin America and opened up the South America Mission Society. It was called the Patagonia Mission Society, it later on became. And that's come through to a very fast-growing Latin American Anglican church. You may probably will talk about it in the future, but just Saturday, for instance, I was sitting with 9 of our missionaries, some in Africa, this is from our local church, some in Africa, some in North America, some in Brazil. And this pooling of resources that you're talking about is something we're having to do even across denominations. So it's a very exciting moment for Latin American Anglicanism. My friend Miguel Uchoa in Brazil, you may know Miguel, of course, you know Miguel, and I are often in contact on how we can use cell groups and different things. So it's just a word of encouragement that in Latin America too, there is this great spread of Anglican faith. But my question to you is basically how, maybe unpack a little more this pooling resources everywhere to everywhere, which is a sort of a new push of mission beyond even Anglicanism, but working with Anglicans, how you'd further illuminate that.
Yes, well, I've tried to do it, and I will do it, of course, in the other lectures, in the coming lectures also. Thank you for continuing to remind us of Latin America. I did mention my fairly recent visit to Argentina, where I met both with Anglicans, but most of the time with people from other churches also, who were all active in mission. And what I realized, as I often do in these circumstances, is that the Argentinian church, I know it has many financial and other problems at the moment, but it's a very large church, and it is quite well resourced in terms of human resources and the willingness for sacrificial service and accessibility. So Argentinians, for instance, can get visas to teach Spanish in Middle Eastern universities, which Europeans would not get. I mean, I know of certain positions where they just wouldn't have got a visa, and certainly Americans wouldn't have got it. So, if there are people available to reach a nation or a group within a nation, how are the resources for such people to be found? And my point is that they ought to be found from anywhere. It doesn't matter from where they're found. And I think we've got to sort of let go of this domestication and sort of owning mission in that sort of immediate sense. I know this is difficult because congregations like to send their own people and to support their own people. And in some ways, this is natural, as I was saying. But if we are really going to make a breakthrough, we have to set this aside, at least in some cases. So that is what, but we'll talk about this later.
Thank you. That's very
Good.
much
Calling on Damon, and I will unmute you, Damon.
Yes. Bishop Michael, you mentioned, am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Okay. Yes, you mentioned that the Church of the East sent some missionary to the Middle East and then further west into Europe. Did those missionaries include Chinese missionary?
Oh yeah, they were both. The missionaries, the first missionaries who came were both Chinese. This book that I was mentioning discusses their work. It's a classic work. The Monks of Kublai Khan, it's called, because Kublai Khan was then the ruler in Beijing. Yes, what happened was, I mean, West and East are relative terms, of course. So the Church of the East developed outside the Roman Empire at first. That's why it was called the Church of the East. It developed in what was then the Persian Empire, which extended right up to Mesopotamia. Particularly after the rise of Islam, because this church could not carry out its missionary work within the Islamic domains, it began to be more active. It had been active before, but to be more active beyond the Islamic world. And so many of its monks were active throughout, along the Silk Road. They were very active along all the countries of Central Asia, to Mongolia and to China. There's been some discovery since the 1930s in China of the extent of the contextualization that they carried out. For example, the discovery of the so-called Jesus Sutras in a desert city in China showed how far they'd got. And then with the monks of Kublai Khan, we see them coming back to the West. So they'd gone from the West, which for them meant the Middle East. I mean, that's where they had gone from. The seat of the Nestorian church came to be Baghdad. So they'd gone from there and from Iran and the Gulf to the East, what they call the East, which was Central Asia and China. But then they came back to the West. When they got to the West, they got involved with the church there, of course, and one of them became the leader of the Church of the East, became the patriarch, Rabban Sauma. And one of the monks was then sent to Europe to see if these people, the Church of the East missionaries, could cooperate with the Roman Catholic Church in mission. He was very well received and all that, but nothing came of the exercise.
But this is very significant, because if there was such a Chinese missionary from the Church of the East, from China into Middle East, that could be the first ever missionary from the Chinese people.
This is possible, yes.
That's this is mind-boggling to me.
Yeah. Well, sure. Next time I see you, I'll bring the book.
I will look up the book immediately after this lecture.
Yeah, it's quite a rare book. It's called The Monks of Kublai Khan by Wallace Budge.
Yeah, okay. By the way, you mentioned about the Anglican Church in Hong Kong.
Yes.
And the New Territory. I actually study in a secondary school run by the Anglican Church. Mm-hmm. It's actually, the name will tell you it's an Anglican church. It's called Diocesan Boys School.
Yes. Yes. Not a very imaginative name, but
Yeah, so it's very, I mean, the Anglican Church built many, many good schools in Hong Kong. Some of the best schools are Anglican churches.
And also social service. The social service of the Anglican Church was quite widely admired, even during the period that the British were there. And that still carries on.
And Bishop Hall, you know Bishop Hall?
Yes, yes.
And he's very well known for the social service in Hong Kong.
Indeed, yes, yeah.
And his son, Chris Hall, came to speak in our chapel some time ago.
Yes, it's continued under his successors. I mean, he was the bishop during the Second World War.
Yeah.
And had to act in very, very difficult circumstances.
Yeah.
But the Chinese leadership of the church has continued that service under Archbishop Kwong, who was the leader of the province there. And yes, that in that part, the Holy Catholic Church in China, as it's called, is flourishing.
Thank you.
Let's go ahead and turn to Daniel Button, and I'm unmuting your. Go ahead, Daniel.
Right, thank you. Well, likewise, my ears perked up when you were talking about the Nestorian Church, because like probably many people, I had never heard of the Nestorian Church until I was at seminary and we had to learn about Nestorius. And that led me to a little bit of an interest in the Nestorian Church. And it just so happens that whilst I was a lecturer at Redcliffe College, someone gave to me, well, this is the picture. I don't know if it's the very same stele that you showed, but someone who was a missionary there had brought back a rubbing of that stele, a full size.
Oh yeah.
Size rubbing of
Very interesting
of the whole thing, and I have never known what to do with it. So if OCMS is interested in and has a place to display it, or if anyone there knows of a good place to display it, as you mentioned, it features in the book Setback and Recovery, and this one was brought back by a CMS missionary, I think named Chris and Helen Middleton.
I'll tell you, Daniel, we have a rubbing ourselves, so we'll be duplicating if we brought that.
Well, another book about the mission of the Church of the East is this one. I mentioned it by Bishop William Young, called Patriarch, Shah and Caliph. It is a PhD research level book. Well, it was his PhD at Edinburgh. And it gives in detail all the sources to which we can go for a history of this mission. The Nestorian Church has had a very tragic history. I mean, it flourished for many centuries, even under the caliphs in the Islamic period. And it flourished in China, but then, of course, once the dynasties in China that had been favorable to it were replaced by others, round about the 13th or maybe even the 14th centuries, just as Western missionaries were coming into China, these Christians were tortured, persecuted, and expelled from China. They then began a whole series of persecutions of these churches in the Islamic world, ending, of course, with the First World War. We hear about what happened to the Armenians, but actually what happened to the Assyrians, that's another name for Christians of this tradition, was also very bad. The West reneged on its promise to create a separate homeland for them, and they were massacred by the Ottomans and others. The Kurdish people were also involved, strangely enough. So the church that exists now in India and the Middle East, and of course in many Western countries now, is a shadow of its former self. The other big thing to realize is that many of these Assyrian Christians, Church of the East Christians, came into communion with the Catholic Church in the early modern period, partly to gain a protector for themselves. So the Chaldean Church in Iraq, the Chaldean Catholic Church in Iraq and Iran and Syria are really these Church of the East Christians who are in communion with the Catholic Church.
Wow.
One thing I wanted to note in terms of Damon's comment, I worked in Singapore for 11 years, but one of the interesting deposits of the Anglican Church and Anglican Church mission, which you've touched on several places, is education and the tremendous impact. So in Singapore, when you look at percentages of the educated, the percentages of Christians who are at the highest levels of society because of excellence in education is quite pronounced. And so their representation in the key engines of society are much higher than their actual numbers in the population. And much of that is owed to the work of the Anglican Church in the setting up of schools.
I think that's right. I'd heard some time ago that 25% of all teachers, school teachers in Singapore, are Christians. So that, of course, is greater than their overall population.
I've heard a message that Ann Clayton that you would like to speak. Ann, can you, I'm going to unmute your mic. I can, or you can. All right, and then I see your hand too, Roger. I'm trying to unmute you, Ann. There you go. Go ahead.
Now. Michael, I wanted to ask you a question about the Chaldean Church. I work with Embrace the Middle East, and we actually are working in Iraq, and one of the archbishops or bishops, I get very muddled as to what their position is, over in Scotland. We work with them quite closely, which I'm quite surprised at because I hadn't really heard of them much. So they are doing a lot of work to help us and the Catholic Church, as you were saying, in Syria and in Iraq to help people go back into their positions. So although we may not hear very much about them, they are, the smaller number are really trying to do their very best. And I just wondered if you knew anything about any of the present people that are working in Iraq like that.
Yes, I was in Iraq a couple of years ago with the Chaldean Church, and Archbishop Wada, who is the Archbishop of Erbil in the northern part, is very active in working with refugees of all kinds. In fact, a Yazidi leader said to me, I was visiting one of the camps, and he said, quite spontaneously, he said, you know, our religion doesn't show us how to help other people. Your religion does. And so I was just listening, of course. But it was an interesting comment. The Iraqi church consists of a whole number of groups. So the Chaldean church is the largest, the Chaldean Catholic Church. The Syrian Catholics are also quite large in Iraq as well as in Syria. Then you have the Syrian Orthodox Church, and many of the treasures, as it were, of manuscripts and art in Iraq, Christian art, were actually held by the Syrian Orthodox Church. And I remember talking to the Archbishop of Mosul of how he fled with these treasures in advance of ISIL. And sometimes it was just a matter of yards. But he did save some of the treasures. So Archbishop Wada said to me on one occasion that the two agencies that have been most effective in working with the church, with the refugee situation, were Aid to the Church in Need, which is a Catholic charity, and Samaritan's Purse.
Yeah.
So I report that for what it's worth.
Yeah. Yeah.
Roger, did you wish to ask a question? I will unmute you.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to say to the Bishop, thank you for your newsletters of the 80s and the 90s. I read them with great interest.
Thank you.
In one sense, that is probably 40 years ago. And what I'm commenting on is really the speed of change that is taking place all over the world. And one comment I would like to make, I saw Tim Dakin, one of your successors, celebrating on the internet the communion service. Now, the Christian communion service, and he started with, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God." And the readings for the day were written by Jews, by a Jew, Matthew. His name will be Emmanuel, God with us. And then you go to the end of Matthew's gospel, and it's, "I am with you always to the end of time." Now, this strikes me very interestingly. I have just done a course through Oxford University on Sumerian culture and how the Jews took a stance over and against the polytheism and the paganism and the secularism of their day and age. And it seems to me that the challenge of the church today is still to take that challenge to paganism, polytheism, and so on. The gospel must be something to do with the sovereignty of the universal God. And how is this expressed today in a multicultural society? Huge problem.
Yes, and I mean, the question is one of translatability. I mean, I mean, when you say the Bible and the Jewish people, apart from Luke, the whole of the Bible has been written by Jewish people. Job is not about a Jew, but it's probably written by a Jew. So you know, that's it's almost universal as far as the Bible is concerned. The question is, how does this get translated into the various cultures of our day and languages? And Professor Lamin Sanneh, whom many people will know, his first book was Translating the Message, which was about the way in which the Bible has been translated again and again. The Armenian church, for instance, the translation of the Bible into Armenian created Armenian culture. And this can be repeated, of course, for many other cultures then and now. The Jewish people often say how the Torah has been hugely influential in the world in terms of lawmaking, for example. At the University of Bristol, in the Department of Law, not theology, the Department of Law, there's a chair for biblical law, because it is recognized what influence biblical law had on the development of law in this country. Now, the Jewish people say that these are the ways in which the Torah has been important. But of course, the point is that it is Christians who spread this.
Yes.
It wasn't the Jewish people. It was, it was mainly Christian mission that spread this knowledge, and is still doing so. How this relates to people's existing beliefs is the thorny question. So I will come later on in this series, God willing, to this question of how we are to communicate the gospel, and to what extent can the spiritual awareness and even the terminology that people use for the divine or for the spiritual world, to what extent that can be used in evangelism and in the vocabulary that Christians use. Quite a controversial area, of course. Let's just take one example. When William Carey began to translate the New Testament and then the Bible into Bengali, he made 8 revisions of his translation. I mean, whilst at the same time doing other translation work. And for a cobbler, that's pretty good. But anyway, what word to use for God was one of his main problems. In the end, Carey chose the word Ishwar, which in Sanskrit and Hindi and other northern Indian languages means the personal aspect of the Supreme Being. You see? And so the Bengali Bible uses that term. The result was that Muslim Bengalis thought, therefore, that Christianity was some kind of Hindu sect. You see, because of the use of Hindu terminology, until in the 70s, I think this was, a translation was made into Muslim Bengali, which used a different set of spiritual terminology. Now, the question is, to what extent is this justified, and is there any option for a missionary but to use what is there? So, I mean, on the one hand, the Bible is countercultural, as you were saying, certainly in the context of the ancient Middle East, in many respects, not just monotheism, but for example, the Bible's teaching on human sexuality, on sexual behavior, on the equality of all before the law, on jubilee, on slavery, many things. But on the other, in the task of communicating the gospel, we have to take account of people's vocabulary, their beliefs, their worldview. Otherwise, we are unable to get across the message of the gospel.
Just one point, you mentioned Apollo Kivubulaya. My daughter at Edinburgh University has just written and published a book on Apollo Kivubulaya.
What's the title?
I'm not quite sure, but it obviously Apollo Kivubulaya is there in the title.
And the author will be Emma Wildwood.
Emma Wildwood, yes.
Right, okay.
And I have, at some point when I was actually in Singapore, did some proofreading of it at the time. Right. And it's about cross-cultural communication from Uganda into what is now Congo and so on. An interesting read.
Good. Well, we'll turn now to Ben Knighton. Ben, go ahead. I'm unmuting you.
Emma gave a seminar or a lecture like this here in the seminar room on Apollo, Apostle to the Congo. So the book that was going towards has eventually emerged. Now, the whole of Israel in Deuteronomy 26 is obliged to recite, "A wandering Aramaean was my father." If one were to translate that into English in the modern period, it would go, "A heathen was my father." In other words, it was on a heath outside of civilization, worshipping a god under the sky, the stars, the rocks, the trees, the streams, and so forth. And it so happens that the nomadic peoples that you have mentioned, plus the semi-nomadic Karamojong with whom I first lived in Africa, do have a high god, and a high god who is above all else. So the tie-up with the Christian faith, particularly the Old Testament and the Old Testament of the Old Testament, Genesis, is relatively close, certainly much closer than the secular world is today to the Bible. So there's not an inherent problem there. However, as you know, Bishop Michael, working for David Guattari, having volunteered to be on the margins of the church with nomadic peoples, I was put in a theological college.
Yes.
This is Anglican, and so was the best student in that college, who was a Gabra from the north, and has spent the rest of his life in Cambridge or just outside Limuru as a vice chancellor.
Yes.
So Bishop Andrew Adano's vision of evangelism by camel, though he did it, it struggles to find a place in the Anglican Church in particular, which is so much about being sedentary, about being educated, about being clothed, about taking on Jewish monarchical formularies, plus a heavy overlay of European assumptions, that there remains a continual imbalance of the church whereby it is still as difficult over 40 years for a nomadic church, which is almost a contradiction in terms, because everybody thinks of church as a building, for a nomadic church to solidify amongst a traditional people. What can be done about it?
Well, I mean, first of all, this business about a supreme being, John Beatty's book and also Kwame Bediako's research has shown that the word for God in Christian churches in most of sub-Saharan Africa is actually the word that was used for the supreme being. And Kwame, I think, has shown, or maybe Beatty, I can't remember, that this term for a supreme being actually is older than the term for the various gods of polytheism as they emerged. That is to say, his thesis is that there was an original monotheism, which then got somehow demotic and turned into polytheism of various kinds. But there is some evidence of this also in the Islamic world, that the pre-Islamic Arabs had notions of a supreme God, and it is undoubtedly the case, attested in literature, that Allah was the term used for this supreme God. Whilst there were also, of course, other gods who were sons or daughters of Allah. So the question then for the missionary is what term to use, and how to give, not just what term to use, but how to give that term Christian content. I mean, this has always been the case, hasn't it? So the Hebrew El or Elohim can also be used of pagan gods. The Syriac, Aramaic, Syriac, Allah. Aramean, by the way, means Syrian or Semitic. Of course, Abraham was from sort of that part of Iraq, which is almost on the Gulf. Aramean means, people who speak Aramaic, and he was nomadic, but not all Arameans were. And the most ancient settled civilizations are also Aramean. I mean, Damascus is arguably the oldest city in the world. So, how we can infuse these terms, these ancient terms, with new meaning, and this has always been the case in the New Testament itself, as Lamin Sane points out. The New Testament itself is translation. You know, it is reporting the Aramaic, which only comes through occasionally, of Jesus' speech in Greek. And as you know, the New Testament was not translated back into Aramaic Syriac until about 150 AD. But it's still the liturgical language of many of the churches we've been talking about, and the language of their Bible. Allah, the Syriac for God, used in the Bible, is etymologically anyway related to Allah. Nobody can doubt that. Should Christians use Allah for God or not? I mean, this is such a controversial issue to which we will come.
Sure.
But the point is that the Arabic-speaking Christians, whether we like it or not, use this term for God. In this sense, it's no different from the theos of the New Testament, again, widely used for pagan deities, but then used of the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. God is a Teutonic word, again used for pagan gods. There's nothing sort of sacred about it, but Christians have turned it into a way of speaking of the God of the Bible. And this must be true everywhere, mustn't it? The question of whether there can be a nomadic church, I mean, this is one of the reasons why Arabia remained unevangelized, was that the churches were all sedentary around the periphery of Arabia Deserta. There were many Arab churches, but there were city churches and town churches and village churches. And so the nomadic tribes largely, I mean, there were one or two nomadic tribes that were evangelized, but they're largely unreached. And that, of course, was the opportunity for the coming of Islam. There are problems with nomadic evangelism. I mean, I was talking about the evangelism of nomadic peoples in southern Pakistan. One of the difficulties that the evangelists and the clergy faced was that people were taught and baptized and then they disappeared. And you wouldn't see them for years. Then they'd turn up one day and they'd forgotten everything they'd been taught, you know. So the whole thing had to be done again. In some places, nomadic Christians are better protected than sedentary ones in Afghanistan, for instance. I mean, I don't want to talk too much about it, but I think it is better in some situations for people to disappear sometimes.
We'll turn now to Andrew Woodcock. Andrew, I'll unmute you.
Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon, Bishop Michael.
Good afternoon, sir.
I note that you took great care to say so-called Nestorians, and you've spoken liberally about Armenians and Syriac Christians as well. Thinking of the ecumenical councils of the first millennium, where there was a real passion for protecting the mystery of who is Jesus Christ, and unfortunately both those groups, possibly wrongly, but they fell on the wrong side of that debate for, in inverted commas, Orthodox Christians.
Yeah.
Could you give a word of wisdom to missionary priests, but also just random Christian punters who turn up in parts of the world where so-called Nestorians, the Church of Persia, or Syrian or Armenian or Coptic Christians are in profile, what your overall approach would be to balancing doctrinal orthodoxy, historical accident, and Christian love?
Well, Bar Hebraeus, who was a Syrian Jacobite Christian, was writing, I think in the 13th century, that many of these differences amongst the churches at the time of the councils were verbal differences. That what one meant by nature, the other called substance, and someone else called hypostasis, and so on. And so I'm very glad that in recent years, there's been an agreement sponsored by the World Council of Churches and the Roman Catholic Church with the so-called Monophysite churches, the Jacobites of Syria, the Copts of Egypt, the Syro-Malabar Christians of India, which says that they both affirm the same Christological faith, both sides. Those who endorse the Council of Chalcedon and those who don't affirm the same faith in Jesus Christ. There has been also a more limited agreement of this kind with the so-called Nestorians. But certainly the Catholic Church has an agreement now with the Nestorians, that agreement on Christology, and even on the Eucharist, which the Eucharist, which is a very ancient rite, does not have the words of the institution in it. But Rome has declared that it is a valid Eucharist. So, yeah, there's been progress. Where Anglicans are concerned, there's been an Anglican commitment, as I was saying, with the Ethiopian Church, which of course is also one of these churches, but also with other churches. When CMS first arrived in India, it worked not with non-Christians, but with the ancient churches of India. And the commitment was also not to plant Anglican churches, but to renew the life of the existing church. And for this reason, I mean, it's imperfectly kept promise, I have to say, but for this reason, these churches often respect Anglicans more than they respect other Christians who they think have tried to proselytize among them. So in the Ethiopian Orthodox Seminary in Addis Ababa, many of the faculty are Anglican Christians, some from this country. The new missionary thing in Gambela that I was talking about just now and so on, with the Sudanese and other ethnic groups, has raised this question: what is, can there be an Anglican? Well, there is now. There is an Anglican church in Ethiopia for the first time. And out of necessity, not out of deliberate planning, as it were.
Well, good. I think with that, we will tie a bow on it.